Once there was a king, and the king had 7 daughters. And he liked nothing more than spending time with those girls in his garden. And his favourite pastime, was taking a tray full of beautiful ripe oranges. And with his own hands, he would peel each one of those oranges, take away the pith, and then take a segment each and give it to his daughters. And you know, those oranges, they never tasted better than when their father fed them with his own hands. As those girls grew up, their thoughts turned to other things. They turned to marriage. And one afternoon, all 7 of them were talking about the kind of husband that they wanted to have. And the first one says, well, of course, he's got to be strong, he's got to be fit, he's got to have a 6-pack, hasn't he? And the others giggled, and the second one says, yeah, but strength is one thing, but how about intellect? How about intellect? I would like a husband with whom I can sit and discuss all manner of things, history, religion, politics. And the third one says, yes, strength is one thing, intellect is another, but what about poetry? I want a husband where every morning I wake up, there's a fresh poem underneath my pillow that's been written especially for me. And they all giggled, and finally they came to the youngest one. Me and my husband are going to build a 7-story mansion. And the others asked, not get servants to do it. She says, no, we're going to build it with our own hands. And they nudged and laughed and joked and teased her. And look at her, getting down with the people. She wants to build herself. And she felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Well, one afternoon, the king was there doing his favourite thing and feeding his daughter those beautiful oranges. And he was in a bit of a playful mood. And so he asked his first daughter, the oldest one. He said, Kuriya, tu kehdi kismat khandi hai? Whose fate is it that feeds you? And the girl said, well, of course, father, it's you. It's your fate that feeds us. And the second one said the same. And the third one, each one said the same until he came to the youngest one. And he asked her the same question. Tu kehdi kismat khandi hai? And she sort of shuffled and she said, well, father, I think it's my own fate that feeds me, the fate that's been given to me by God. And the king started laughing. He says, tu shorty, yeah, you're the youngest one, so I'll ask you again. Tu kehdi kismat khandi hai? And she said, well, you brought us up not to lie, father. I can't lie. It's my own fate that feeds me. And now the king wasn't smiling. He said, I'm going to ask you for a third time. And think carefully before you answer. Whose fate is it that feeds you? She said, I'm sorry, father. I can't lie. I can't tell an untruth. It's my own fate that feeds me. Acha, we'll see when the time comes. And one by one, he got each of his daughters married to the kind of man that they wanted to marry, the kind of man they dreamt of. When it was the youngest daughter's turn to get married, here's what he said. He called his vizier, the advisor. He says, you see outside my palace gates? There is a leper, a gori. And that leper, he moves himself around by a trolley. He drags his knuckles on the ground like an animal. He makes his way through my streets this way, like a beast. I want you to marry my daughter to that leper. That's exactly what happened. She was married that day without any ceremony, without any pomp. And what did she do? Well, she took her headscarf, a junni, she tied it around her forehead, and she grabbed the rope that was attached to his trolley, and she placed it on her forehead, and she started dragging that weight behind her. And as she went through the streets, most people didn't recognize that it was the princess, the king's youngest, his favourite. And those that did, they went, hi, bachari, poor girl. Oh, what destiny, what kismet she should have to fall so low so quickly. But she ignored it. And there she was going from street to street, from gully to gully, putting as much distance between herself and her old life behind her. This was now her fate. This was her future. And still she carried on dragging him through the streets. They begged for food. Some people would see the sight of him. They would see the sores and the scabs on his body, and they would turn away in disgust. Others would throw stones at them. Well, one afternoon they found themselves by a swamp. And she took her husband and she placed him under a large tree, the shade of that tree, and she said, I'll go and find some food. I'll be back as soon as I can. And off she went. And as the husband was there, sitting on his trolley, his eyes were barely looking through slits. And he saw something. At first he thought he imagined it, but then he looked again, because out of nowhere appeared a crow. And this crow dived into that water, into that swampy water, and the water was still for a few moments, but a few seconds later, it re-emerged. And now it turned into a white dove. And that dove circled that swamp 3 times and off it flew. Well, the leper couldn't believe it as it happened a second time. A crow dived into the water only to re-emerge, purged, cleansed as a white dove, and circling that swamp 3 times, off it flew into the distance. And he thought, if it can do this to the birds, what can it do to me? So he held onto that overhanging branch And he dropped himself as a dead weight, clinging onto that branch for dear life, and the water covered him all the way over his head. Now, sometime later, the wife returned, and when she looked, there was a handsome man sitting there. "Have you seen my husband?" May I? No, please don't tease me. "Have you seen my husband?" And he repeated the words, "No, it's me. She says, "You tell me, I'm going to call the police. What have you done with my husband?" He says, No, it's me, really." And she was panicking. He says, "Listen, if you don't believe me, watch the birds." And a second later, that crow dived into the water only to re-emerge as a dove. He says, "See? And look, my hand, this is the only part that is diseased, the part that was clinging onto the branch." And then she believed him, and she took that hand and she dipped it into the water. And when it came from the water, well, now it was perfect, like the rest of him. And she looked at him and she realized, well, for the first time, she saw what shade of brown his eyes were. For the first time, she saw that his teeth, well, they shone like polished cowrie shells. And now they set off, side by side, not one ahead and one behind, now equal. And that place is still there in Amritsar in the Punjab. And that tree is still there, the Pingla tree, as a symbol of hope, as a symbol of pilgrimage. And off they walked, now to find his village, to find his people. And they walked for days and days, still begging for food, but now there was a different purpose, and now there was a different demeanor about them. And finally, when they entered the village, well, people started gathering, and they looked at him, they touched his skin, they touched his hands, they couldn't believe that he had been cured. And soon an old man from the village came, the old man who they all called the grandfather of the village. And he took that young couple. And there was a plot with rubble everywhere. And he says, this was your ancestral home. Many, many years ago, when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, a 7-story mansion stood in this very site. And the girl and the boy looked at each other. They knew what it meant, but they would build their own place. And the next day they started digging the foundations, digging deep. And after several days, well, they heard a sound, a clunking sound, and as they looked, there was a clay pot. And the belly of the clay pot had been broken by the shovel. And pouring out were motis, pearls. And the couple looked at each other. They knew what it meant. One of the ancestors had buried this treasure, and obviously he'd forgotten about it, or for some reason couldn't return to it. It was a gift from the ancestors, and it meant that they could start building. So they built the first story, and my goodness me, it was amazing. Because at the front it was a shop, and at the back end it was their living quarters. And what did they sell in the front part? Cotton. The finest cotton that India had ever seen. And that became a prosperous business, and soon from the proceeds of that they had enough money to build a second story. And on the second story they started selling silks and satins, and on the third silver, and on the fourth gold, and so forth and so forth. And on the seventh story the most precious of commodities, saffron. And this saffron was so beautiful, was so fragrant, was so intense that people would not only come from other parts of India, they would come from other countries on ships and take sackfuls of this saffron back to sell and trade. Now they were as rich as kings themselves. But you know her father's fate, her father's destiny, her father's kismet had not been so good. Because barely 2 weeks after he'd banished his daughter with the leper, invaders came. And he barely managed to escape with just his life intact. And what did he do? He took a wagon. And what did he do? Well, now he got a cart. And the cart he dragged behind him. And he went from street to street, gully to gully, selling oranges. Every day trying to put as much distance between himself and the old life behind him. And every day he would go from gully to gully, hawking his wares. Santre, santre, taji, taji, santre, 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 get your fresh oranges. After some time he ended up in a particular village where he was there standing, taking a breath, wiping the sweat off his forehead in the shade of a 7-story mansion. And once again, santre, santre, taji, taji, santre, mitte, mitte, santre. And the girl, she recognized the father's voice. And she looked out the window, she saw him. And she said to one of the servants, "Please, fetch that man, fetch him to me." And as he was brought up, well, she disguised herself with a veil. And as he was led up the 7 stories, each story, well, the quantity was more opulent, was more luxurious, was more valuable than the last. And when he got to the 7th story, well, there she stood and she says, "I was just wondering, uncle, please allow me the honor of feeding you. It would be an act of kindness, an act of charity, an act of recognition for my ancestors. Please, would I be permitted to feed you?" And of course, the old king, he hadn't had a good meal for such a long time, and he sat down, crossed his legs, and first she brought some water so he could wash his hands. And then she left and reappeared a little while later with a dish of kheer, but now she was wearing a different coloured suit, still veiled. And she gave him that kheer, that beautiful rice pudding, creamy, with fat sultanas and little bits of saffron on top. And he ate it. It was delicious. And when he gave her the plate, well, she took them and she reappeared, now in a different coloured suit with some dal. And he looked and he thought, it looks like the same girl. And he ate the dal. And then she reappeared again with a different coloured outfit and a different dish. And he thought, what's going on here? So he took a bit of food and he flicked it on her bare foot. And when she reappeared the fifth, sixth time, he saw that piece of food and he says, what, are you mocking me? Are you mocking an old man and his poverty? And there's a little flutter behind the veil. And she said, mock you? Why would I mock my own father? As she removed the veil. And when he saw that it was his own daughter, he says, how? And then the servants were asked to fetch her husband. And her husband stood next to her and touched his father-in-law's feet. And he saw this handsome young man. He says, how? I sent you away with nothing. I sent you away with less than nothing. And she told him. She told him about the sacred swamp. The sacred swamp that is still a symbol of hope. She told him about the gift from the ancestors. She told him how they're built with their own hands and their hard work. And the king, he hugged his daughter and he kissed her cheek 1,000 times. And he says, हाँ सही गल है. It's completely true. तू अपनी किस्मत खान दिया. तू अपनी किस्मत खान दिया. It's your fate that feeds you. It's your fate that feeds you.